Hello, friends. My name's Randy Hollerith, the Dean of the Cathedral, and I'm really thrilled to be here this afternoon with Kelly Brown Douglas, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Canon theologian of the Cathedral. So every Sunday during Lent, if you watch us online, there'll be a link there where you can send us an email about questions or comments about the sermon or insights that you might have that will further our conversations later on. It is at talkback@cathedral.org is the name of the email address to send your comments, and we hope you'll participate and let us know if you are enjoying this conversation series. So Kelly, thank you for a really powerful sermon today. You had two great lessons between the story of the fall and Adam and Eve and the story of Jesus' 40 days in the desert. And you started your sermon by talking about how this particular story in Genesis has been used and misused so much over the centuries, and it really has. And talk a little bit more about that. I think primarily about how it gets misused for or misunderstood as history rather than poetry. That it was written to be a poetry full of truth, but not full of historical fact, and yet it's often been used as a way to talk about how the world was actually created, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's funny because as I looked at the lectionary readings for this week, I thought, that the temptations of Jesus is also a very much preached story, and so that didn't jump out at me as something that I wanted to do. And I wanted to avoid initially that Genesis text, but I said, no, it can't be avoided, because in fact it's sort of the elephant in the room of our lectionary readings because it has been used and misused so much. And I, like you, have the most common sort of misuse of it has been that it has been told as history and taken literally, right? And so this conflict between science and that story. And so, as I've often said, to use that story that way is to miss the rich meaning of it.
Right.
And so I really challenged myself to dig into the story and to try to, at least in some ways, sort of take away, demythologize, if you will, take away some of the myths about the story, because it has been used in so many ways, not only as this wedge of science and religion, but it's been a harmful story.
The whole notion of women as tempters.
Right.
And that was Eve's fault for
That's
the
right.
fall of humankind, right?
That's right.
That whole notion is deeply ingrained in our culture, right?
That's right. And the whole notion that Adam the male was created first,
right?
And so that the female is subordinate to Adam, and so that misses the point of the story. And so it was important for me to, in some way, at least demythologize that, or take that misunderstanding away, because it does miss the point of the story of how we're interconnected and how indeed when gender appears, it appears together.
Right.
And so
in its wholeness,
neither male or female exist apart from the other, so they emerge together at the same time. And it's really, as you know, a wonderful piece of poetry, and some of what we miss in the telling of that story is we miss it because of the translation.
Right.
And so we miss the play on words throughout that's going on in that Hebrew passage.
And let's talk about this play on words in just a minute, but I also think that many people in the Western culture don't understand that there can be something that is full of truth, but not full of fact.
That's right. Yeah.
And that fact and truth are not necessarily the same thing.
No, that's exactly
right. There are no scientific or historical facts in that Genesis story.
That's right.
But it is full of truth about the nature of humankind, about how we've fallen away from God, about God's love for us, and I think it's such an important thing for people to get.
No, I think that's right. And, we have become, particularly in Western culture and our mindset sort of since, as we would say, the Enlightenment, we have been so captivated by our own sense of reason and logic. And so we have lost the ability to really think mythologically
Yeah.
in myths, right? In myths, it's people think of myths now as that which is not true.
Right.
But early people use myths to point to a truth that is beyond what our own capacity as human beings and our own capacity as people who use reason and logic. It's beyond that comprehension, so it points beyond
That
us.
which is the deepest truth.
That's right, the deepest truth.
Right.
And so they use myths, and so this is a myth which holds much truth.
Right.
And so you're so right that, and the biblical witness is so full of these kind of myths and stories. And so it really is to begin to try to make them that which they are not, misses the point of that these people are trying to make, and really this deeper questions of human meaning, deeper questions of who we are, deeper questions of who God is. And so you're exactly right. And this story, the Genesis story, is sort of the quintessence of that, right?
And speaking back to the play on words, you talked a little bit about this, but say some more about it. That Adam is not the name of a man.
That's right.
It's Ahadam.
That's right.
And Ahadama.
That's
and
right.
those are play on the words. Talk a little bit more about that. I think that's fascinating that most people don't realize.
Yeah, and so when God creates the earth creature, and I say earth creature, but we have translated that man, right? And that's a mistranslation.
Yeah, that Adam really means earth creature. Right?
Adam really means earth creature. And so in Hebrew, it's Adam or Ha-Adam, as you said. And that's intentional because the Hebrew poet, whoever did this, wants to show the connection, because earth is Ha-Adamah. And so the earth, so that Adam, the earth creature, Adam, comes from the earth, showing our relationship, the intrinsic relationship between us and the earth. But in our translation, right, we've translated it man.
Right.
Perhaps the best translation would be human being, or humankind. And if we do that, then we also have to understand that this earth creature is not gendered. What's trying to be shown here is the relationship to the Creator and the relationship to the rest of creation. From the dust, I love the line in our liturgy in Ash Wednesday, from dust you are, to dust you shall return, right? And so we've also translated sort of the earth is dust, and that's Adama.
And I love the, speaking, when you talk about Ahadam and Ahadama, you have the earth creature, the first created, and the earth itself. That the two are intricately connected. That you don't have Ahadam without Ahadama, without
That's
the
right.
earth, and that one comes from the other, and that we are. What God wants from us most especially is to be caretakers.
That's right.
To love and care for God's creation, and you spoke so beautifully about that, and you talked about how God asks us to love for care for creation, not just in loving and caring for the physical earth, which is deeply important, but also for how we love and care for one another.
That's right.
That's tied up in that.
That's right. And inasmuch as we ignore or abuse or don't care for any part of creation, it's really going against our own self-interest, right? We're really not taking care of ourselves. And that's the interrelationship. And so to destroy one part of creation really is self-destruction. And so that to me is what's always so powerful about that. And so when we say no to others, we're saying no to ourselves. It's self-destruction.
When you were preaching that, I had this, what came to mind for me was the old English notion of warden. A warden in the old day was someone who was in charge of a tract of land or an area of land, and their job was to look after it, to make sure that it was kept safe, to make sure that it wasn't violated, and that in some ways, some of the things that God's asking us to do is to take the little tract of life that we have within our reach and be God's wardens, with one another, with the poor that we come into contact with those who are treated unjustly, with God's creation itself. And I think that's a powerful sort of serving where you're planted.
That's right. And that's our task. I mean, what even when, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, Randy, that in preparing for the sermon, that you see things that you never saw before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these aha moments. Someone after the service said, I had a real aha moment in your sermon when you said, now we know the truth because the human creatures ate from the tree of good and evil. So now we have no excuse. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. And I said to the person who said that to me afterwards, well, that was an aha moment for me as well, because I didn't see that until really my sort of final draft. I said, and so you have these aha moments. And another one of those for me, sort of overhaul that pulled this sermon together, was recognizing just what you said, that we are sort of caretakers, wards, but it's intrinsic to who we were created to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's, if we just do that, then we have, just as they say, you got one job,
right.
to till and keep the garden, the part of the world in which God has placed you. But that's at our essence, who we're created to be. Not all of this other stuff. Take care of what God has given us. If we do that, we'd be quite occupied. And so that struck me, that is a part of our created commission and call. We have been assigned to care for God's creation.
The first instruction that we're given, the only instruction that we're given after literally being created from the dust of the earth.
Right.
And how often in our history, especially the American history, have we taken that passage to mean we are supposed to control, subdue, and overtake creation, right?
That's
dominate.
Exactly right. Dominate.
And dominate one another.
That's right, because to dominate the earth, they're all connected. It means that we end up with this sort of frame and paradigm that we can dominate others who are what perceived as weaker than us.
Yeah.
And so we have this whole domination kind of mindset to live over and against God's creation. And from the very beginning, we are told that no, you're supposed to live with it and you're supposed to care for it. And so you're exactly right. And once we have that sort of understanding that we were put on this earth to, in fact, lord over it or dominate over it, then we see what that issues for.
Right.
And so the systems and structures of domination.
And to switch that mindset, is such a fundamental switch.
That's right.
But if you can own it and claim it, it changes how you look at everything.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. To me, that's the power of that story, and that's what the ancient Israelites were wrestling with. As they told that story, or as they recaptured that story, like, how are we to live in relationship to God, which means how are we to live in relationship to one another? And things had gotten out of whack, as we know, for the Israelites when they began to tell that story. And so you're exactly right. If we can get that right, then everything else ushers forth from it. And so that's why it was almost important, and I said, I think, in the sermon, that it demands, it compels us to read it anew. And so for me, as I was sort of preparing for preaching this week, I knew that I couldn't avoid it, because it's almost at the crux of why we have found ourselves in the predicament as human beings in relationship to our world and one another that we have found ourselves in. And so what we have done with this story is we've gone back and we've read ourselves and the way in which we have structured this world back into that story. And we have to, with all of these stories, we have to now read it anew and read out of it. And I think if we do that, read out and not in, then it holds the key to the kind of relationships that we ought to be having with one another and God's creation. And it sounds so easy, maybe it is, but what's not as easy is to get this whole different, as you say, sort of mindset.
The eyes to see and the ears to hear.
Right.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for being with us this Sunday. It's always a joy to have you back.
Oh, it's good to be here.
Preaching. It's great.
And I enjoy always these conversations with you.
Too.
Thanks, Richard.
Well, thanks for being the first one.
I know,
we
the
did this
guinea
one
pig.
together. All right. Blessings.
Thanks.